Welcome back, dear listeners, to our familiar Nighttime Stories Hour. Let's reunite with audio nighttime stories. Today's story is titled House Number 13. For those discovering our channel for the first time, please support us by clicking the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you won't miss any new stories. If you enjoy today's story, consider giving it a like. The more likes a story gets, the more YouTube will recommend it to others. We truly appreciate your support. Now, without keeping you waiting any longer, let's dive right into the story. At the end of a narrow alley, an old house belonging to Mrs. Thuong unexpectedly opened its doors wide early this morning, a rare sight. She was overjoyed, her face beaming with happiness. And no wonder, as she had been trying to sell this house for over a year. All because of two words, haunted house. The house had once been rented by a man who, overwhelmed by work pressure and heartbreak from being betrayed by his lover, tragically hung himself in one of the rooms. Ever since, rumors spread like wildfire, claiming the house was haunted. At first, Mrs. Thuong was terrified. She invited several well-known spiritual masters from the city to perform rituals to dispel the spirits, but nothing changed. The stories only multiplied, even landing the house on the pages of local newspapers, driving away any potential tenants. Desperate, Mrs. Thuong slashed the price, hoping to get rid of the burden. And finally, her luck turned. Early last week, while she was busy contacting real estate agents to help her find buyers, she received a surprising phone call. Even more astonishing, the caller wanted to buy the house outright. At first, Mrs. Thuong suspected it was just a ploy by the agents to negotiate the price. But after arranging a meeting, she discovered the buyer was a family from the countryside who had recently won the lottery and wanted to move to the city. Of course, Mrs. Thuong subtly hinted at the house's ghostly reputation, but the family seemed completely unaware and even cheerful about the affordable price. After receiving the deposit, they promised to move in and pay the remaining balance this morning. At exactly 8 a.m., a moving truck stopped at the entrance of the alley. A man stepped down from the truck, gave some quick instructions to the driver, and then walked straight to house number 13. He raised his hand and pressed the doorbell. In no time, Mrs. Thuong came rushing out, her face glowing with excitement. "Oh my goodness, Tone, you're here so early," she exclaimed. "Yeah, we finished loading the truck earlier than expected, so we left right away," Tone replied, scratching his head. "Is the house ready yet? If not, I can wait outside." "No need to wait. Come in, she said eagerly. "Do you need help with the furniture? My nephews are strong. They can help carry everything in no time." "That would be great. Thank you so much." Tone smiled in relief. A little while later, the truck driver and Mrs. Thuong's nephews were bustling in and out, unloading furniture and carrying it into the house. Everything was brand new. Since the family had just won a large sum of money, they decided to buy all new household items. Tone had grown up in a humble farming family on the outskirts of town. Although it was called a suburb, the area he lived in was poorer than many rural villages. His parents had passed away early, leaving him with only a few small rice fields. He and his wife, Lynn, had been married for 3 years, living a simple and peaceful life together without any major arguments. The decision to buy this house came by chance. On a trip to the city to claim his lottery winnings, Tone noticed a house for sale sign posted at a bus stop. The price was surprisingly low, and the location wasn't bad, so he took it as fate. After nearly 3 hours of unpacking, everything was finally in place. The house wasn't very big, but it had 2 floors and was surprisingly clean. Tone handed the remaining balance to Mrs. Thuong, whose face lit up with pure joy. By noon, everyone had left, and the house was quiet. Tone was alone. Lynn was still busy in their hometown, planning to catch a bus with their baby boy, Bin, later in the evening. Tone decided to make use of the quiet time to prepare a special dinner to celebrate their new home. He went to the market, buying a large fish and a kilogram of fresh beef, planning to cook hot pot, Lynn's favorite dish. He returned home around 3 p.m., knowing Lynn wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. Feeling exhausted from all the moving, he lay down on the cool tiled floor to rest. The cold tiles and the gentle breeze from the air conditioner quickly lulled him into a deep sleep. But not for long. In a hazy half-dream, Tone suddenly felt like someone was standing over him. A dark figure loomed above, as if trying to say something, though no words reached his ears. But the figure's gestures made it clear they were angry. Very angry. The dream felt disturbingly real, and Tone didn't wake up until his phone rang loudly beside him. He jolted upright, heart pounding, and looked around the room, checking for any sign of someone else. But there was no one there. Glancing at his phone, he saw Lynn's name flashing on the screen. He quickly picked up the call. "What were you doing? I called you a dozen times." Lynn snapped. "Come open the door. Ben is exhausted from the trip." "You're here already?" Tone asked, still shaken. I fell asleep. I'll come right down." He hurried to the front door. Lynn stood there, her face flushed with annoyance, holding their sleeping son. She glared at Tone as she handed him the child. "You're unbelievable," she huffed. "If you were so tired, why not just sleep until morning?" Tone scratched his head sheepishly. "I'm sorry. I was just so tired I knocked out without realizing." Lynn rolled her eyes but let it go, stepping inside the house. She still couldn't believe they now owned a home in the city. It wasn't big, nor in the best location, but it was theirs, and that was more than enough to make her happy. Dinner ran late, and Lynn grumbled about Tone's nap pushing back the schedule. But once they settled down to eat, her irritation faded. The house was cozy, the food was delicious, and their little family was finally starting a new chapter. After dinner, they put Ben to sleep in his crib, then sat together on the second-floor balcony, enjoying the night breeze. "Hey," Tone whispered, holding his wife close. "We've finally made it. Aren't you happy?" "Of course I'm happy," Lynn said, resting her head on his shoulder. "But I've been thinking, I want to start a small business. Can you rent a shop for me in town? People say if you come to the city with money and don't invest, you're just wasting your luck." Tone chuckled and nodded. "Anything you want. From now on, we can finally live without worrying." Or so he thought. That night, long after Lynn and Ben had fallen asleep, Tone woke up gasping for breath. In his dreams, the same figure returned, but this time they were aggressive. They grabbed his arms, pulled at his legs, and even sat on his chest, pressing down so hard he thought he might suffocate. When he finally snapped awake, drenched in cold sweat, he turned to check on his wife and son. Lynn was still peacefully sleeping, and Ben snored softly in his crib, unaware of the turmoil haunting their new home. Tone wiped his forehead, convincing himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. "Maybe I'm just too tired," he muttered, closing his eyes again. But deep down, something felt wrong. Very wrong. Tone couldn't fall back asleep right away. His throat felt parched and dry like desert sand. Reluctantly, he rose from the bed, quietly making his way down the stairs in search of water. The house was cloaked in darkness, save for the faint glow of a small chili-shaped night light perched atop the refrigerator. Too lazy to flick on the main light, he tread carefully, each step creaking beneath his weight. But halfway down the stairs, Tone froze. There, at the bottom, stood a figure, unmistakable, yet shrouded in shadow. His breath hitched. Reflexively, he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. And in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. His chest tightened. Was it a thief? Fear wrapped around his heart like a vice. Without hesitation, he switched on every light in the house, steeling himself to scream for the neighbors if need be. Yet after meticulously searching every corner, opening every door and cabinet, Tone found nothing out of place. Half an hour later, exhausted and bewildered, he collapsed onto the sofa, gulping down sips of cold water from the fridge. The quiet hum of the air conditioner did little to calm his nerves. As he drifted into a restless sleep, an unsettling sensation lingered. The feeling of someone whispering in his ear, cold fingers brushing against his skin, tugging at his shirt. He wanted to wake up, to confront whatever presence lingered, but his eyelids were heavy as stone, locking him in a fitful slumber. Morning came, but it brought no relief. Tone woke with an aching body and a throat as rigid as iron. He felt as though he'd scaled a mountain in his sleep. Lynn, his wife, noticed the fatigue etched into his face and asked, concern lacing her voice, "Are you okay? Do you need me to buy medicine?" "I'm fine," Tone rasped, brushing her worries aside. "Probably caught a chill last night. Just need a bit of rest." Lynn nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. Her husband rarely fell ill, and when he did, it never lasted long. She made a mental note to check on him later but had errands to run. Slinging her bag over her shoulder, she reminded Tone to watch over their son, Ben, carefully. Stepping outside, Lynn inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp morning air. Smelled different, the scent of city life, of change. She still couldn't believe how drastically their lives had shifted after Tone's lottery win. The day he brought home the winning ticket, she'd thought it was a cruel joke. But as they clutched nearly 10 billion dong in their hands, reality hit like a thunderbolt. Wealth, however, invited shadows. Family and distant relatives, people who had once barely acknowledged them, now crowded around like moths to a flame. But among those familiar faces lurked someone else. Someone Lynn wished she could erase from memory. Duc, her old lover. If outsiders looked at Tone and Lynn, they'd think of them as the perfect couple, together for nearly a decade. But what no one knew was that, in the fragile space before their wedding, Lynn had almost left Tone for Duc. She had been ready to trade her life for a new future until tragedy struck. Duke's family went bankrupt, and with that, her dreams crumbled. The cruel twist? The baby she carried wasn't even Tone's. When news of Tone's windfall spread, Duc resurfaced like a specter from the past. He called, texted, and demanded to meet. And when Lynn finally agreed, his threats were venomous. Promises to expose her, to drag her through court until she was left with nothing. They argued late into the previous night, but he refused to compromise. He summoned her again this morning. She had no choice but to go. Lost in thought, Lynn collided with an elderly woman on the street. The woman's frail hand shot out, latching onto her wrist like a clamp of ice. "You live in that house, don't you?" the woman whispered, eyes wide with something between fear and urgency. Lynn recoiled, confused. "What are you talking about?" The old woman's grip tightened. "Leave. Get out of that place. Before it's too late." Then she pressed her hands together and muttered a prayer under her breath, her lips trembling. Shaken but unwilling to make a scene, Lynn wrestled free and hurried away. The cafe where she was to meet Duc was uncomfortably close to their new house. How did he know? And what exactly did he want? She spotted him right away, slouched in a corner, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his smile sharp and predatory. Well, 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 Duc sneered as Lynn approached. "Just yesterday you were a small-town girl. Now you're all dressed up like a city princess. Fancy. Cut it out," Lynn snapped, pulling out a chair. "Just tell me what you want." Duc leaned back, blowing a cloud of smoke into her face. "What's the rush? We've got time. Have a drink." "I don't want to see you ever again," Lynn hissed, her patience unraveling. "Just give me a number. Whatever you want, say it." He chuckled darkly, extinguishing his cigarette with a cruel twist. "I don't take requests. I make demands. You pay, or your perfect little life shatters." Lynn's heart sank like a stone. Her hands trembled beneath the table. "How much?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Duc raised 5 fingers. 50 million? She asked, desperate. He laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. 500 million. No negotiations. You've got 10 days. If I don't get the money, well, you know what happens. With that, Duc stood, tipped his hat, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Lynn paralyzed in her chair, her mind spiraling into darkness. 500 million. A sum she couldn't touch, no matter how hard she tried, because everything was in Tone's name. Her lies, her past, her fragile new life. It was all about to crumble, and somewhere, deep in the marrow of her bones, she felt that the figure Tone saw the night before wasn't just a figment of imagination. Something was watching them. Something That knew. Although Tone had always been gentle and indulgent toward his wife, no one could predict how he would react if the truth unraveled. And then, there were the families on both sides. If the secret surfaced, Lynn feared she would have no choice but to clutch her child and throw herself into the river. The mere thought of such a tragedy made her tremble, and she silently vowed to herself that she would never let it happen. Leaving the coffee shop, Lynn wandered aimlessly, her mind tangled in endless knots, desperately searching for a way to gather the 500 million VND she needed. Standing before her home, she inhaled deeply, trying to relax her tense expression before stepping inside. Tone was watching cartoons with their son, his face alight with joy. Seeing his wife return empty-handed, he frowned, puzzled. "Didn't you say you were going shopping? Couldn't find what you needed." It was just an excuse for Lynn to leave the house. She didn't answer, only muttered a vague response. Tone, lost in his time with their child, didn't notice her unease until lunchtime. "Are you okay? You've been quiet all morning. Are you feeling unwell?" he asked, concerned. "No, I'm fine. Just thinking about a few things," Lynn replied, her voice brittle. "Is it about your business? Don't worry. If you want, I'll rent you a space on the main street. Money sitting in the bank doesn't do much good anyway," Tone said, his tone warm and reassuring. Hearing this, Lynn's eyes gleamed. She nearly burst with relief and excitement. "Really? Oh, thank you. You're the best husband ever," she exclaimed, her heart racing with a newfound plan. That very afternoon, Lynn didn't return to the coffee shop. Instead, she went to a real estate office, a place that attracted all kinds of people, from eager investors to tattooed gangsters loitering outside, ready to take on tasks for the right price. Inside, Lynn scanned the room and approached a small desk where a burly man in a suit sat. He greeted her with a bright, toothy smile. "Hello, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" "I'd like to rent a commercial space," Lynn replied, her voice steady. "What kind of space are you looking for?" "Any kind will do, but I have one condition," she whispered, her eyes glinting with a dangerous light. The man's smile faltered, and his brows knitted. Lynn wasted no time explaining. "The rental deposit comes from my husband, but I want to skim some of it for myself. Just a little capital to start my own business." The man, seasoned in his craft, quickly caught on. He leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "That's doable. How much do you want me to inflate the price? We can draft a contract and make it official." Lynn detailed her scheme, promising a generous kickback for his cooperation. After all, in this world, anything money couldn't buy could be secured with even more money. Leaving the office, Lynn felt emboldened, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. She returned home in high spirits, brimming with affection toward Tone. She even cooked dinner, playing the perfect wife to sweeten her deception. After dinner, the doorbell rang. Lynn knew exactly who it was but feigned ignorance. "Who is it?" she called out. "Good evening, ma'am. Is this Mrs. Tran T. Lynn's house?" "I'm from the real estate agency," the voice answered politely. Tone, still cheerful, helped Lynn open the door, welcoming the agent inside. "Sorry to bother you this late," the man said, bowing slightly. "No worries at all," Tone replied, gesturing for him to sit. They reviewed property photos and Lynn quickly picked one. "This one, Tone. It's perfect, right on the main street. Ideal for a clothing store," she chirped. Tone squinted at the screen, trying to understand. He was a simple man, valuing space and brightness over location and status. But seeing Lynn's excitement, he immediately turned to the agent. "How much is the deposit for this place?" Tone asked. The agent hesitated, glancing around the humble home as if assessing their finances. "Well, the deposit is quite high. I'm afraid." Tone bristled, his pride stung. "Don't worry about that. If my wife wants it, we'll pay whatever it takes," he declared. "Really? Well, the deposit ranges from 600 million to nearly 1 billion VND, the agent replied, carefully watching Tone's face. "No need to discuss further. We'll take it," Tone said without hesitation. Lynn's heart soared. She hadn't expected things to go so smoothly. The agent left, and Lynn hugged Tone tightly, tears of joy brimming in her eyes. "You have no idea how happy you've made me. You're the best husband ever," she whispered. Tone chuckled, holding her close. "You're my wife. You gave me a beautiful son. Do whatever makes you happy. We'll always support you," he said sincerely. For the first time in weeks, Lynn slept soundly. But Tone stayed up watching a late-night soccer match. During halftime, hunger gnawed at him, so he went to reheat leftovers. Yet, the moment he lifted the lid, he recoiled. The food had spoiled. "That's odd," he muttered. It had only been 4 hours since dinner, and the house was cool. How could the food spoil so quickly? Brushing it off, Tone made instant noodles and returned to his game. After the match, he turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, ready for bed. But as soon as the bedroom door clicked shut, the sound of a light switch echoed from downstairs. Tone froze. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe he hadn't turned the kitchen light off completely. But just as he settled back into bed, another sound pierced the silence. Louder, sharper. His chest tightened. Annoyed and uneasy, Tone crept down the stairs to investigate, unaware that something unseen had already begun to stir within their home. Halfway down the stairs, Tone froze. The kitchen light was on, but he distinctly remembered turning it off after finishing his noodles. His pulse quickened as he stepped into the kitchen. The sour stench hit him first. On the stove, the pot of leftover food had spilled over. Bits of meat and oily broth splattered across the floor. A cat? A rat? His mind raced for rational explanations. But like the night before, no matter how thoroughly he searched, he found nothing. Resigned, he cleaned the mess, exhaustion and frustration weighing heavily on him. By the time he crawled into bed, the soccer match was long over. Sleep, however, remained elusive. By 1 a.m., Tone sat up, rubbing his face. He grabbed a cigarette and stepped onto the balcony, hoping the smoke would calm him. He hadn't smoked much since Ben was born, only lighting up when stress consumed him. The city never truly slept. Motorbikes zipped through distant streets, their headlights flashing like restless fireflies. Tone sighed, telling himself it was just city life, unlike the countryside, where the streets were deserted by nightfall. But as the thought crossed his mind, he stiffened. A shadow stood at the front gate. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, Tone saw a man, unmoving, face obscured. Tone squinted, his heart pounding. He didn't recognize the figure, and after a long, tense moment, decided to go downstairs to check. By the time he reached the gate, the man was gone. Tone stepped out, scanning the street, but it was empty. The silence felt unnatural, wrapping around him like cold fingers. His skin prickled as he hurried back inside, bolting the door and checking every lock before retreating to his room. He collapsed onto the bed, too drained to think. By morning, Lynn let him sleep in, only shaking her head when she saw him sprawled out, snoring. "Watching soccer all night like a teenager. I don't know what's so fascinating about it," she muttered. But when Tone finally woke, he felt like he'd been crushed under a mountain. His limbs were heavy, his head throbbing. "You okay?" Lynn asked, concern in her voice. "I feel awful. Can you get me some medicine?" he rasped. Lynn placed a hand on his forehead, gasping at the heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning up. Stay in bed. I'll make you some porridge and buy medicine," she said, rushing to the kitchen. As she cooked, her thoughts wandered to Duke, anxiety gnawing at her. She prayed he wouldn't change his mind. They were too close to backing out now. Lost in thought, Lynn barely noticed the reflection in the fridge door. A figure stood behind her. She smiled, assuming it was Tone. "You should rest. I'll wake you when the food's ready." Silence. The sound of running water echoed from the bathroom, steady and unrelenting. Lynn frowned, puzzled. When she finally turned to check, the bathroom was empty. The faucet, however, was still on. How did he go back upstairs so fast? And leave the water running? She muttered, turning it off. By noon, she carried a steaming bowl of porridge to their room. Tone lay in bed, eyes closed, chest rising and falling steadily. Keen played in his crib, babbling to himself. Relieved, Lynn set the bowl down and gently shook her husband's shoulder. Tone shot up, eyes wild, chest heaving. "What's wrong?" Lynn cried, startled. Took him a moment to catch his breath. His voice trembled. I had a nightmare," he whispered. "Let me guess. A ghost?" Lynn teased, but her smile faded when she saw his face pale. "It sat on my chest, grinning, teeth sharp as knives. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. If you hadn't woken me up." Lynn swallowed hard, her heart thudding painfully. "It's just sleep paralysis," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "It happens when you're stressed or exhausted. Once you're better, it'll stop." Tone nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. He couldn't ignore how weak he'd felt since moving in, how his body constantly ached, his skin clammy, his dreams laced with shadows. He finished the porridge, strength slowly returning. By evening, he could finally walk around the house again. "When should we go place the deposit?" Lynn asked cautiously. "I don't want someone else renting the shop." Tone thought for a moment, then nodded. "Let's do it today. I'll withdraw the money from the bank." Lynn's relief was palpable. She kissed him on the cheek and watched him leave, her mind already racing with calculations. Yet, even as she basked in her victory, her chest tightened. It had been 2 days since Duc last called. Was he waiting, or planning something far worse? To reassure Duc and stop him from causing trouble, Lynn took her phone and sent him a message, saying she was about to gather enough money. At first, Lynn intended to call, but she couldn't get through, so she had to text instead. In the late afternoon, Tone returned home with a bag full of money. Lynn opened the door and beamed. "Come in. Today I made braised tofu with pork, your favorite dish. Eat plenty of rice later. Okay? My wife is truly capable." Tone nodded, smiling, as he took off his shoes and stepped inside. He reached back to close the door, but suddenly froze when he saw a pair of eyes staring at them from across the street. It was the old lady Lynn had encountered at the alley's entrance the day before. Unlike yesterday, this time the old woman stayed silent, her gaze fixed on Lynn. Feeling uneasy, Lynn spoke up. "Are you looking for someone?" The old lady remained still, so Lynn stepped outside to ask directly. "What is it? Are you looking for someone?" "You shouldn't stay here," the old woman warned. "I'm telling you, there's a ghost inside that house. It's terrifying. You must leave now before it's too late." "A ghost? Are you crazy? Do you think I'm too nice? So you're making up nonsense to scare me? Let me tell you, I'm not in the mood for this," Lynn snapped, feeling irritated. The old woman sighed, her wrinkled face contorting painfully. She clasped her hands together in a pleading gesture, then turned and walked away. Lynn, still frustrated, muttered angrily. She resolved that if she saw the old woman again, she would find her family to complain, or even suggest sending her to a nursing home or mental hospital. Brushing aside the strange encounter, Lynn carefully counted the money. She felt a pang of regret, as though she were throwing 500 million VND out the window. But if paying off Duc would bring her peace, she had no other choice. After transferring the money to the broker, deducting the store rental costs, she set aside exactly 500 million to give to Duc. Lynn quickly called him, but after nearly 10 attempts, Duc still didn't pick up. What's wrong with him? Is he changing his mind? Lynn wondered, but her guess was only half right. Duc did change his mind, not to refuse the money but to raise the amount to 600 million. Lynn's heart sank when she read his message. All her careful planning over the past few days had crumbled. It had been so hard to scrape together this sum, and now he wanted even more, cornering her completely. Frustrated, Lynn tried to arrange a meeting with Duc to discuss it face to face, but he refused, replying with only a short message. "I'll give you 10 more days. If you don't have the money by then, prepare yourself." That was the last message he sent. No matter how many times Lynn called or texted, he never responded again. Fear and anxiety consumed her. She tried to convince Duc to accept the 500 million temporarily, promising she'd get more money once her business stabilized or from her husband. but no reply ever came. That night, after taking his medication, Tone quickly fell asleep. His health had improved significantly, and he would likely fully recover by the next day. But Lin lay wide awake, restless. She kept trying to call Duc, hoping he might relent, but her phone only returned silence. Exhausted, she finally stepped onto the balcony to get some air, hoping the quiet night would help her think of a solution. But the stillness of the alley only heightened her fear. She dreaded the idea of her life unraveling, of being kicked out onto the street without mercy. The more she thought about it, the more she hated Duc. Ever since he appeared in her life, everything had spiraled into chaos. But regret was useless now. Lost in her thoughts, Lin suddenly noticed a figure standing at her gate. It only took her 5 seconds to realize it was Duc. Panic surged through her. Was he here to expose everything? Lin rushed downstairs, ready to beg him for a few more days. But when she opened the gate, Duc was gone. She checked carefully for any notes or signs he might have left, but there was nothing. She breathed a brief sigh of relief, but it didn't last. If he had come once, he would surely come again. The thought gnawed at her mind, making her more anxious by the minute. The next morning, another day slipped by, shortening the countdown to the deadline. Tone felt better, but now he was worried about Lin. She hadn't slept at all the previous night. The dark circles under her eyes and her gaunt face made him uneasy. He gently hugged her and whispered, "Lin, what's wrong?" Overwhelmed by his tenderness, Lin could only mumble an excuse. She couldn't possibly tell her husband the truth. Later, Tone offered to go grocery shopping and cook, but Lin panicked. What if Duc came while Tone was gone? So she snatched the basket from his hands and rushed out, trying to shop as quickly as possible. Returning home, Lin's heart skipped a beat. There was another figure standing at the gate. But it wasn't Duc. It was the old woman again. "Why are you doing this? Why do you keep bothering my family?" Lin snapped, her patience wearing thin. The old woman shook her head, looking even more distressed. "It's too late. You must leave this house. Leave now. Speak properly. I don't even know you, so stop causing trouble," Lin shouted. But suddenly, the old woman clutched her chest and sank to the ground, gasping for breath. Panicking, Lin stammered, "What's wrong? Where do you live?" The old lady weakly pointed toward the last house at the end of the alley. "Okay, wait here." Lin rushed to find the old woman's family, ready to scold them for not taking care of her. She knocked loudly on the door, and a man about Tone's age came out, frowning. "What's going on?" he asked. "Come with me. Your mother's collapsed in front of my house, talking nonsense and scaring everyone." Lin snapped. The man's face turned pale. "What did you say? Are you crazy?" Lin was startled. "Wait, isn't she your mother?" The old lady, with wrinkled skin, hunched back, wearing floral clothes. Before she could finish, the man's expression shifted to sheer terror. He rushed out of the house, shouting, "Where? Where did you see her?" "There, right in front of my house." Lin pointed, but her voice trailed off. The old woman had vanished. The man swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "I understand now. How many times have you seen her?" Lin answered straightforwardly without hesitation. As all 3 times she had encountered the old lady, she felt annoyed and remembered her vividly. The man shook his head, sighed, pointed towards his house, and gently said, "I think you should come inside." Lin, still bewildered, laughed nervously. "What now? What's wrong with your mother and son this time?" Yet, she followed him inside. The man pointed to an altar in the corner of the house. It looked like it was set up for someone who had recently passed, with funeral flags still hanging. But what caught Lin's attention most wasn't the altar itself. Her smile faded instantly when she saw the photo on the altar. It was the old lady she had just seen. Lin gasped in horror, her basket slipping from her hand and crashing onto the floor. The man shook his head and explained, "My mother passed away over a month ago. People say they still see her, but I didn't believe it. But now you, a stranger, describing her so accurately. It must be true." She's come back. Why? Why would I see her? I don't even know her. Lynn stammered. I'm not sure either, the man said. But my mother was kind. She never meant harm. Maybe she just wants to tell you something. I don't care, Lynn cried. You think a ghost showing up to scare people is a good thing? She grabbed her basket and ran out of the house as fast as she could. When she finally reached her own home, her mind replayed the image of the old lady's ghost, sending chills down her spine. Lynn bolted the door, trembling. Seeing her so distraught, her husband Tone grew worried. It took over half an hour for Lynn to calm down enough to tell him everything. Tone listened, wide-eyed, before bursting out laughing. Are you kidding me, Lynn? Ghosts? Really? But her pale, terrified face told him she wasn't joking. His brow furrowed. You've seen her 3 times? Are you sure? Yes, just now. I'm so scared, Tone. What if she's haunting me? Lynn sobbed. Calm down, baby, Tone reassured her. There's always a solution. I'll go back to that house and check it out. He stood up and left immediately. Just as Lynn had said, the man in the house confirmed everything. He promised to invite a monk to perform a blessing for his mother's spirit. Tone lit an incense stick at the altar, bowed his head, and prayed. But the moment he finished speaking, the incense burst into flames. Tone, familiar with spiritual rituals, felt a chill. He knew the old lady's spirit was indeed present. He returned home, gently holding Lynn's shoulders. It's okay. They'll handle it. You don't need to worry. I'm still scared, Tone. If you see her again, I'll find a monk. For now, wear this. He handed Lynn a bracelet his mother had left behind, supposedly blessed at a famous temple. No evil spirits can touch you with this. Lynn nodded, wearing the bracelet, but the fear still lingered in her heart. That night, a message popped up on her phone, making her jump. She had almost forgotten about Duck and the money, but the message made her blood run cold. I changed my mind. I want 1 billion. You have 3 days. Or else. Lynn nearly collapsed. The amount was impossible. When Tone came up from the kitchen, he noticed her pale face. Are you okay? You look awful. I'm just tired. I'll rest in our room for a bit, Lynn whispered, then hurried upstairs. Once alone, she broke down, sobbing. She glanced at Ben, their sleeping baby, and bitterness surged through her. She blamed the child for the mess she was in. After calming herself, Lynn tried to call Duck, but he didn't answer. Furious, she muttered, You pushed me too far, you bastard. A sinister plan began to form in her mind, something she never thought she would dare to do. She messaged Duck, telling him to come to her house in 3 days to get the money. Then she deleted the entire conversation, her eyes gleaming with malice. Over the next days, Lynn feigned exhaustion, letting Tone see her deteriorating. She fabricated nightmares of the old lady's ghost tormenting her, even claiming the spirit cursed her from the foot of the bed. Worried, Tone suggested seeking help, but Lynn insisted only a psychic named Twee, from his hometown, could help. Conveniently, Twee would only be free in 3 days. On the 3rd day, Tone left for his hometown, giving Lynn enough time to execute her plan. She bought a large suitcase and a sharp knife, then waited. Night fell and Duck didn't show up. Lynn grew anxious, but when she texted him, a reply came instantly. I'm here. Terrified, she checked the front door. No one was there. She called his number, and to her horror, the ringing sound came from upstairs. Clutching the knife, she climbed the stairs, following the sound. She found the phone in her bedroom, next to someone sleeping under a blanket. Thinking it was Duck, she stabbed repeatedly, screaming curses. But no blood seeped from the blanket. She ripped it away and collapsed in shock. It was Duck, but he was already dead. His body was blackened, decomposing. The bedroom door creaked open. Lynn turned, and her heart stopped. Tone stood there, silent, his eyes cold. Tone, why are you here? Lynn stammered. Why shouldn't I be? He replied calmly. Before she could speak again, Tone grabbed an ashtray and smashed it against her head. Lynn collapsed unconscious. The next day, the news reported a gruesome murder. Duke's body was found with multiple stab wounds, and Lynn was arrested as the prime suspect. She was hospitalized under police guard, showing signs of severe mental instability. Rumors spread about the haunted house, adding an eerie layer to the already chilling case. The TV news ended, and Tone quietly turned off the screen. He walked over to the baby's crib and smiled. "Sleep tight, Ben. The story ends, leaving the truth buried with the dead." Thank you for following this chilling tale. See you in the next story.